So Florida Congressman and Trump VP hopeful Byron Donalds has came under fire recently for some comments that he made that sounded as though he was suggesting Jim Crow was a better era for black people. Hakeem Jeffries had a lot to say about this. We're going to watch this clip first, and then we're going to talk more about it.
Come to my attention that a so-called leader has made the factually inaccurate statement that black folks were better off during Jim Crow. That's an outlandish, outrageous, and out-of-pocket observation. We were not better off when a young boy named Emmett Till could be brutally murdered without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when black women could be sexually assaulted without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when people could be systematically lynched without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when children could be denied a high-quality education without consequence because of Jim Crow. We were not better off when people could be denied the right to vote without consequence because of Jim Crow. How dare you make such an ignorant observation? You better check yourself before you wreck yourself. I yield back.
So Byron Donalds immediately said that Hakeem Jeffries is gaslighting everyone. He said that everyone is taking what he said out of context. So, just to be fair to Byron Donalds, we're going to show you the clip starting before he made the Jim Crow reference so you can see how he went about leading into it. And you be the judge. Was he suggesting this is a better time, or was a better time for America, or was he not? Take a look.
I grew up with my mom. My dad and my mom, things didn't work out. As an adult, I look at my father and I say, bro, I don't know what happened, but you my father and I love you.
Wow.
I don't know what happened. I wasn't there.
Wow.
But I'm gonna tell you this, growing up, the one thing I knew I wanted to do, and this is not about my father, this is about what I wanted to do, is I wanted to be a father to myself.
Wow.
And so one of the things that's actually happening in our culture, which you're now starting to see in our politics, is the reinvigoration of black families with younger black men and black women. And that is also helping to breed the revival of a black middle class in America. You see, during Jim Crow, the black family was together.
That's right.
During Jim Crow, more black people were not just conservative, because black people always have been conservative minded, but more black people voted conservatively. And then HEW, Lyndon Johnson, and then you go down that road, and now we are where we are.
You know, I've said for a long time that anytime they use the phrase "Make America Great Again," I really believe they're wanting to take us back to that era. So many conservative pundits, so many pro-Trump talking heads out there latches onto this idea that if we could just go back to the 1950s, the world would be a much better place. And they don't realize all of the progress we've made since then. They want to erase all of that. So it sure sounds to me as though he's suggesting that. But then he goes on CNN and he's faced with Abby Phillip, who just really takes him to task. And of course, you could go ahead and brace yourself for this one, folks. He's going to find a way to blame this on the media. Take a look.
A lot of people who heard what you had to say, and a lot of them are offended by the idea that you would repeat Jim Crow 3 times in your comments as if to suggest that that was a time period because that black families were, in your words, together, because, in your words, black people were not just more conservative, they voted more conservatively. That's a good thing. I mean, it sounds like nostalgia. Do you regret using that time frame as a reference?
Nobody ever made nostalgia. That was never the point. It wasn't even about that. And so where now I'm going to get my backup is, I didn't say that. I didn't even insinuate that. That is where the media and, yes, Hakeem Jeffries and a lot of other people are taking
What exactly didn't you
insinuate?
No,
back up.
I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. What didn't you insinuate?
The premise of your question, I did not insinuate. That is what people are trying to weave into what I said.
They always have to find a way to blame it on the media, but I really don't think that this is anyone trying to weave their politics into it. I think it's just us trying to wrap our head around why anyone would reference the Jim Crow era in what sounded to be a positive light. But in this next clip, he says something that is truly laugh out loud comical. Take a look.
I just want to, just to
So what?
clarify my questioning of you. I mean, I understand that this idea that you said it was better, you didn't use the words better. But when you talk about that time period, you're suggesting that because the Black family was together, they were better off than they are now.
See, this is the problem, Abby.
So are you saying that that's not the case? That the Black family was not better off when they were, in your words, together?
Abby, let me put it to you like this.
In the Jim Crow era.
Let's agree on something. I am, obviously one of the better communicators in the Republican Party. I know how to put words together. I do it very, very often. So I'm not going to say something that I do not agree with. What America is seeing right now, especially Black America, is the gaslighting that unfortunately does happen in politics, where you take my comments and you want to weave your own political viewpoint into what I said. What I said is very clear.
Okay, if you truly believe you're one of the best communicators in the Republican Party today, then you have to understand that there's just certain things in this world you don't do, like reference Jim Crow in a positive light. My question would be to Byron Donalds is, would you go to a Halloween party dressed up like Adolf Hitler? Wouldn't that be considered taboo? I mean, you could say that you were a history buff and you just liked studying World War II, but if you went dressed up as him, you would raise some eyebrows, would you not? So when you refer back on this dark time in American history, one of the darkest eras of our time, and definitely the darkest era for Black people, you go back on that and you reference it like, oh, now back in those days we were all together. It sounds like you're spinning it in a positive manner, and that's just something you don't do. So if you truly feel you're one of the best communicators in the party, maybe you should refrain from talking about one of the darkest eras for Black people. But in this next clip, he starts to get fact-checked, and the interview really starts to come off the rails because now he's backed in a corner. He has all the Donald Trump talking points. He has all the MAGA cliches in his bag of tricks. But like always, they don't have the facts. Check it out.
They're rising again in America. That's a good thing. We should celebrate that.
What about other things that may have contributed to the, maybe the decline in marriage rates, which, by the way, is not unique to Black families. That's happening actually across racial groups. But what about other things? I mean, what about redlining? Do you think that had an effect on the Black family? What about mass incarceration? What about the war on drugs, which was pushed by a Republican president whose advisor said it was specifically to target Black people? What about all of those things?
Look, if you want to talk about redlining and a lot of the other policies that were put forward, quite frankly, by the Democrat Party, if you're going to go back to Jim Crow, because Jim Crow was Democrat policies.
Well,
that's what that was.
I know that you know
Abby,
this.
Don't cut me off when I'm trying to make a point.
Let me just, I have to correct on a factual point here. I know that you know that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party of today are ideologically not what they were during Jim Crow. You know that, Congressman. So to suggest that the Democrats of 1920 are the same ideologically as the Democrats of today is inaccurate. So just, you can continue, but
that's not totally true, Abby. And I think if we want to have that conversation about the policy positions between Republicans and Democrats, we can have that conversation.
See, this is one of the easiest MAGA talking points to debunk, and I've done it so many times, but I'm going to keep repeating it over and over until it sticks. Whenever someone says the Democrats are the party of slavery or the Democrats started the KKK, I say to them, do you truly believe that the Democrats and Republicans of 2024 are the same as they were in 1924? Because if the answer is yes to that question, then you've either A, never read a history book, or B, you're completely delusional. And I would say this, which side do the hate groups come out on now? Where do groups like the Proud Boys and the neo-Nazis fall? Who do they stand back and stand by for? And you got people out there saying, we can't take down these statues. We can't take down these statues. That's our heritage. We have to preserve our heritage. Well, those are Democratic slave owners that you're protesting the statues to stay up. So you're saying that you want Democratic slave owners to have their statues. It's one of the easiest arguments you could ever debunk, because you don't see Democrats out here waving Confederate flags and walking around inside of the Capitol building, but that's what we saw from Republicans on January 6th. In this next clip, though, he gets fact-checked again, and he kind of goes silent because I think he realizes he's beat. He tries to say that black Americans have it so much worse under Joe Biden, and well, that's just factually inaccurate. Take a look.
Trying to have a conversation.
I'm going to interrupt you on the facts, Congressman. The black unemployment rate was the lowest in American history under Joe Biden just last year. The poverty rate for black people is the lowest under Joe Biden. So you cannot say empirically for black people that from a financial level, things were better under Trump. There are other ways that you can make this case, but you cannot say that.
You know, I have had a lot of quarrels with the mainstream media, and I've pointed out a whole lot of things that I feel like they get wrong. So I think it's only fair to point it out when they get it right, too. And I think Abby did a good job there of bringing the facts to the table and just showing it to him, because we're so tired of seeing reporters sit there and interview somebody and give them a pass. For Donald Trump to sit there and say that he never said lock her up, and they just sit there and give him a pass, to sit and watch Hannity throw all these softballs at him and him just come back with things that aren't true, and Hannity sit there and let him continue to spread it anyway. And then he can always backtrack and say, well, now I never said that, Trump said that, but you allowed him to say it. But anyway, getting back to the whole Jim Crow statements from Byron Donalds, as he was saying that, when I first heard it, I was going, wait a minute, something here don't add up. You're talking about black people being more conservative and voting more conservative during the Jim Crow era. Blacks weren't allowed to vote during the Jim Crow era. Most blacks were not allowed to vote. And so I went on a website called the Holocaust Museum, the Black Holocaust Museum, and I was reading 8 different ways that black people were kept from voting during the Jim Crow era. From 1960 to 1965, these tactics were used to keep them from voting. Number 1 was violence. They would either threaten them with violence or commit violence against them to scare them to not vote. Then you had literacy tests. You know, nowadays most people can read, but back then a whole lot of poor blacks and poor whites couldn't read, so they wouldn't be allowed to vote if they couldn't read. Now, what was hypocritical about this is they would say, well, the white person, if you read it to them, they can understand it, but the black folks can't understand it, so you can't read it to them, and they weren't allowed to vote. It's pretty hypocritical and pretty disgusting. Then you also had back then that property owners were the only ones allowed to vote. A lot of black people didn't own property. You also had a grandfather's clause, which was pretty interesting because you could vote if one of your grandfathers, your father or grandfather, had voted before 1857. Well, what black person had a grandfather that was able to do that? And then you had all white primaries. There was a time that the Democrats always won their primaries, but whites were the only ones allowed to vote in those Democratic primaries. Blacks weren't allowed to vote in them. Then you had purges, where people just came in and removed people's name from the ballot. They show up thinking they're registered to vote. They get told they're not, and they're told you can register now, but by the time it goes through, the election's over with. And then you have people who are former prisoners. They would go around and they would get blacks on all these trumped up charges, and that would stop them from voting. And then you had poll taxes. Back then you actually had to pay a tax to vote, and a whole lot of blacks and poor whites couldn't afford it. It mainly affected the poor blacks. But for him to sit there and talk about that era and then act as though that what Lyndon Johnson did and everything that happened since has been bad for black America, folks, I really can't wrap my head around it. The only conclusion I can come to is that he just wants to keep repeating these MAGA talking points of, let's take everyone back to the 1950s. When they say make America great again, that's there again. That's where they want to go back to. And I will never understand it because, folks, I don't want to go back to 2023. I don't want to go back to March of 2024. I don't want to go back in time. I want to continue to evolve. I want to continue to do better. I want to continue to progress. I don't see progress as a bad thing. But the Republican Party does, and they're kicking and screaming against it every way they can. And seeing people come out here and line up trying to be Trump's VP and say all these things, it's just completely disgusting to me. I thought Tim Scott was bad, and he is, but old Byron Donalds may have just took the cake from him. That's just, that's one I will never be able to wrap my head around.